I'm Gary Painter, the director of the Price Center for Social Innovation. And for those of you who were here yesterday, you might have been like myself, and I actually couldn't get to sleep last night. The numbers of ideas that were presented were so engaging that it of course that's maybe the academic in me, where ideas get me going more than the average person. But I thought it was really interesting to see all the various approaches that only address issues of how you can take existing resources and think about funneling them to the most effective solutions, but also the need for additional resources and how those can be derived from existing places, whether it's through value capture or other means. Well, this morning, as I promised, we have a wonderful breakfast panel to kind of kick off the day, and a couple of the panels yesterday alluded to the promise zones, and so I wanted to have a panel that kind of explained and what were the efforts here in Los Angeles, and also talk broadly about what are the goals of the promise zone. And the promise zone is a really great example of two things from my perspective. One of the things that it does is it helps to catalyze community engagement across a wide set of sector players to think about a common goal for a community. And I think that's a really powerful organizing concept, and that came out of our conversation yesterday. But the other thing that the Promise Zone does is it recognizes that sometimes you're not going to have additional resources to focus in on particular communities of disproportionate need. And so the Promise Zone actually, and I should say, let me invite the panel up while I'm talking here. So if Eric and Ray and Dixon and Allison can join me. The Promise Zone strategy recognizes that one strategy to catalyze change in these highest poverty communities is to actually allow these communities to disproportionately compete for resources that already exist in the federal government. And so this panel will discuss the genesis of the Promise Zone policy, and the challenges to align resources and departments to do this. So today we have four really important actors in the Promise Zone broadly and also here in Los Angeles. And I'm just going to introduce them in alphabetical order. First, I want to introduce Allison Becker, who's the director of the LA Promise Zone in the city of Los Angeles. She is, as director, she's leading the development and delivery of the policy strategy programs which are designed for the Promise Zone, particularly in the areas of community and economic development. She's a certified urban planner, and Allison has previously served in the Economic Development and Planning Director for Council District 15 in the city of Los Angeles, as well as being the acting city planner for the Community Redevelopment Agency of the city of Los Angeles. To her right, or your left, is Ray Brewer, who's the field office director for HUD's Los Angeles field office. And I appreciate him stepping in today since Mary McBride at the last minute from Washington wasn't able to join us to really show the scope of how HUD broadly is thinking about the Promise Zone initiative. So he's the local face of HUD to state and local governments and serves a pivotal role in ensuring the integration of all HUD program areas. As the field officer and director, Mr. Brewer supervises a portfolio consisting of $41 billion in housing, grants, and funding opportunities, and has served HUD for more than 37 years. To Allison's left is Dixon Slingerland, and he's the executive director of the Youth Policy Institute. And the Youth Policy Institute has a long history here in Los Angeles and focused on transforming LA neighborhoods by reducing poverty through high-quality education and services. Under Dixon's leadership, the Youth Policy Institute has worked with, and is really one of the lead partners with the Promise Zone application, and is responsible as the lead implementation partner for the LA Promise Zone. Dixon is a nationally recognized leader in creating place-based initiatives designed to combat intergenerational poverty. So we're really pleased to have him. And to my right here is Eric Yost. Eric Yost is the community liaison for the LA Promise Zone, and he works with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He's going to serve as the moderator for this panel. He's the supervisory project manager here in the HUD's Los Angeles multifamily office. Eric participates in HUD's Place-Based Initiative Committee as co-chair of the subcommittee focused on embedding place-based work throughout all HUD program offices and headquarters, with a focus on training, technical assistance, and digital tools. He's a graduate of the School of Management at UC Irvine and has previously worked as director of the investment management at Edison Capital, as well as various positions in Wells Fargo and other places. So we're really pleased to have all of our panelists here today. Please join me in welcoming them. And I'm going to turn over the floor to Eric to direct the conversation. Thank you.
First of all, I wanted to thank Dr. Painter. He's also a member of our LA Promise Leadership Council. And so he's very instrumental in helping us guide the vision and the direction of the initiative. And so I really wanted to thank him for inviting us today. And how markets are being activated for social change in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty here in Los Angeles through two really significant initiatives through the White House, which is the neighborhood revitalization initiatives that predated the Promise Zone initiative. So, you know, in the past 24 hours, we heard about the importance of population level change, listening to the impacts of communities from reduced public spending. We were challenged to pay for success. We were also asked to capture value for leveraging private capital. We also saw how innovation in communities can make a difference, and we really focused on the human capital. And what's really interesting is I listened to yesterday's panels, is all these themes and practices and ideas have been discussed or being implemented within the LA Promise Zone. So it kind of brings me to this feeling that I had yesterday after we left the meeting. At some points I had a lot of gloom, some I had glee. Parts of it I felt, being humble. There are definitely moments of being humble. There was humor yesterday, a lot of innovation and impact, accountability for all of us, and allocation was tossed around, scale and success. And I had a chance to reflect on these moments last night of some of that tension we faced yesterday and some of the insights and really on my responsibility in facing these challenges in these neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, and really my role within the federal government to do so on a local basis. And so really at 7:49 a.m. on Tuesday, July 14th, 2015, I don't know if that date or time is apparent to anyone, but that was the moment that the closest approach to Pluto for the New Horizons spacecraft journey was on its last stop of its planetary tour of our solar system that began from the first photographs of Pluto 50 years ago. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because that mission took 10 years to get to Pluto from the United States. And it traveled over 3 billion miles to get there. And the historic voyage of this spacecraft was pretty much straight on course for the encounter, and it was really deemed a success by NASA because it came within 7,750 miles of Pluto at a speed of 30,800 miles per hour. And it actually happened 72 seconds earlier and 40 miles closer than what was anticipated. So our nation is the first nation to now have visited every single planet in our solar system. So you're probably saying, what relevance does Pluto have to activating markets and activating systems? And it's quite interesting when I looked at this. So first of all, it was a mission, right? And so similar missions we heard yesterday, the Promise Zones is a mission and it's an initiative. The voyage was for 9.5 years to be exact. And much of what we shared yesterday was talking about time horizons, and the change in time frames for our Promise Zone initiative is for 10 years. So I hope that rings home. We talked about success and how that was measured. So as I mentioned, the spacecraft came within 40 miles closer than anticipated and 72 seconds earlier. So yesterday we heard a lot about measuring impact, measuring success, and measuring outcomes. Funds had to be allocated for this mission. And much like what we heard about yesterday, there has to be an allocation of funds to initiative, just like there is on this Promise Zone initiative, with having preference points for federal grants to be allocated to a community. And then finally, as much as what happens at NASA, is the event was signaled by a phone home and from the Voyager. And we hope at the end of this 10-year initiative that we have that opportunity to phone home as we do on many of these initiatives. So yes, there are parallels that exist within the federal agencies, even within NASA. And these voyages that we go on with our communities, we can parallel them with miles and seconds in space-time, but we do it with lives and time with people. And we know there's many solar systems out there, and we know there's many people that we need that are in need. So this New Horizon mission really required some patience. And we must also have patience when we're measuring outcomes for communities. But these communities demand and need urgency. So we really must act with patient urgency when we're doing this type of work. So let me take you on the Promozone voyage. So the three critical ingredients for the Obama administration for dealing with communities dealt with the recognized need to change, to look at a community level, and then working with cross-sectors of partners and diverse cross-sector of partners, and then finally having these measurable outcomes. So the Promozone initiative is a White House signature initiative. It's from the Ladders of Opportunity, and it's a place-based initiative. It is not a federal grant, it's a designation. The designation was awarded to high-need geographies, those of high poverty, but also to high-capacity implementers, very different from other programs which are developing capacity. So really the theory of action was to take these high-need, high-capacity communities, partner with the federal Promozone resources, and really accelerate these efforts for these opportunities of change. The focus is around 5 or 6 policy domains, around creating jobs, increasing economic opportunity, improving educational outcomes, reducing serious crime, and leveraging private capital. But those frameworks by the federal government were set up in allowing communities to define what that may need to be for them on a community level. So the initiative is a 10-year initiative designating 20 communities. Currently, there are 13 communities that have been awarded the designation throughout the United States. And for the urban areas, there are certain population levels and poverty levels that needed to take place, which you can see on the slide there. And then the rural and the tribal areas are a little different. Here's kind of a map throughout the country of where the Promozones currently are. So you can see they are scattered throughout the country. We're fortunate to have 2 in California, in Sacramento and Los Angeles. One of the key things with the first round of the Promozones is that there were 12 original federal agencies in the federal government engaged with Promozones, and later the Environmental Protection Agency was added. So this is a cross-collaboration among federal partners. HUD is the lead federal agency for the urban areas, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture is the lead agency for the rural and tribal communities. So hence, you get to see the urban development action of HUD more so than the housing section. Some of the key benefits for the Promozone initiative, as I mentioned, it does not come with federal funds. It's not a grant, but it comes with 4 key benefits, one of which is to have 5 AmeriCorps Vistas that are in the community, working with the community and with the community partners. The second one is focused on having a local federal contact within the community that can navigate the federal system. The third one is the preference points, which is really a true reallocation of federal funds to a targeted community, and preference points for targeted grants in the community. And the last one is tax incentives that would be a 10-year tax incentive similar to the empowerment zones, which we just heard last week was introduced into the House by both members of Congress, both the Republicans and the Democrats co-sponsored the bill. So it is now going through the process. Here's a big map of Los Angeles, a very large city, and we'll go into that in more detail. But the neighborhood that we're focused in for the Promozone is right here. So this is the neighborhoods of, in the north, it's Hollywood. To the east is East Hollywood. And then in the south, we have Pico Union, Westlake, and Wilshire Center. But we have a lot of different more neighborhoods that you think of, like Koreatown, Thai Town, Little Armenia, historic Filipino town. So a lot of diverse communities. Some of our challenging statistics for the area show the high poverty rate. So we have 165,000 people in this community. 35% of them live in poverty. 33% of the households earn less than $20,000 per year. And 35% of those aged 20 or older don't have a high school degree. So very daunting statistics. In addition to this market, 95% of the residents are renters, unlike any probably other community in the United States. So very dense area with a lot of overcrowding. Here in our strategic plan, what the local focus is on creating economic opportunity, improving educational outcomes, making our neighborhoods safe, building equitable, livable, and sustainable communities, with the backbone infrastructure working on building systems and engaging stakeholders. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, all the good stuff, YouTube, so make sure you do that. So what I'd like to do now is I would like to introduce our panelists. And I'm really interested to hear now from our panelists about how they've activated markets to address these children and families living in poverty in these neighborhoods. And first, I'm going to introduce Dixon Slingerland, and he'll talk about the work that he did to start this initiative and the work that he did with the neighborhood revitalization initiatives. Thanks.
So I run the Youth Policy Institute, YPI, based here in LA. And we've had a place-based focus to our work, probably going back 10 years, where we're targeting specific geographies and really trying to saturate those communities with resources, try to integrate programming, try to blend funding streams. And so it was fortuitous that when the Obama administration came in, the president also had this place-based focus, which is his war on poverty, though he's never used that term, would be around this notion of let's take certain places that have boundaries, modeled on the Harlem Children's Zone, Jeffrey Canada's work in New York, and let's use our federal resources to support what's going on the ground in these communities. And like Eric mentioned, this wasn't just about let's put this money where the need is greatest, so obviously it's critical that there's high need, but also let's put this money where there's going to be the biggest bang for the buck and the most likelihood we're going to create a model that is replicable. And that's by going somewhere where there's high capacity. And high capacity doesn't mean that, for example, YPI is a great nonprofit. High capacity means that all the players are at the table that you need to make this work. So the city, the county, the school district, other community-based groups that work in that particular geography. And so this first rolled out through something called Promise Neighborhoods. So that was before Promise Zone, Promise Neighborhood. So at the beginning of 2013, we got the $30 million Department of Education Promise Neighborhood Grant, which was the first of these neighborhood revitalization initiatives to come to Los Angeles. And so that's been a fantastic project, focused more on the education component of the strategy. Those got other pieces. Targeting 18 schools in Hollywood and Pacoima, and with a very heavy focus on tracking outcomes, so 10 outcomes, 23 indicators. That's another thing that's been very consistent about this administration's work, is that there's a heavy focus on metrics and data and being able to track outcomes. And so things like we were able to do for the first time, where the school district here in LA is sharing student level data with us as an external agency so that we can track every kid we're serving in the Promise neighborhood, which is really important to be able to show over time how this is impacting individual students. Also, having everyone at the table means having the private sector and philanthropy at the table. So we have someone here from LA in Sync I saw walk in. So the Annenberg Foundation brought together this effort called LA in Sync, uniting LA philanthropy around how can we make sure that Los Angeles gets its fair share of federal resources. And so that has aligned magnificently with this work around the neighborhood revitalization initiatives, because now we can say not only do we have sort of your public sector at the table, but philanthropy standing up and saying we're going to support these efforts locally. And that's what the feds want to see. They want to see people have skin in the game if they're going to make these kind of investments. So then in 2013, we were successful in getting what at the time were the two other NRI grants. So that's Choice Neighborhoods out of HUD, focused on housing, and the Byrne Criminal Justice Innovation Grant, focused on public safety. So by the time we got to 2013, we happened to be the only nonprofit in the country that had all three of these White House signature initiatives. And so we had the opportunity to team up with the city of LA, with our fantastic mayor, Eric Garcetti, and go after the Promise Zone designation. And at the time, in that first round of the Promise Zones, just as a backdrop, you had to have one of those three NRI grants to even be eligible to apply. So there were a lot of communities in this country that couldn't apply for a Promise Zone because they hadn't received one of the three previous grants, which again goes to this theme, which has been consistent with this administration, that they want to invest in places where the groundwork is already there, where the players are already active, where the commitments are already there. So we can actually have a chance of getting real success with this over the 10-year Promise Zone designation. So I'm glad I get to go before Allison so I can throw out my numbers before she does. So since the beginning of 2013, so before the Promise Zone, so since we got the Promise Neighborhood Grant, the federal government has now invested $162 million in this place-based approach to fighting poverty in Los Angeles. That's 42 different federal grants from 14 different federal agencies. So there's grants from the IRS to do free tax preparation, and grants from NASA, pull this together, grants from NASA to do STEM education in the schools, and grants from the Department of Agriculture for Los Angeles, so we can do initiatives around healthy fruits and vegetables for families in the Promise Zone. So really, I think kind of a historic breaking down of silos between federal agencies, and each agency looking at how can we play our role with the resources we have to support what people are trying to do in these communities. The feds are not telling us what to do. We're going to them and saying, we have these strategies, how can your resources support it? So I think it's been, in that sense, it's been a fantastic success.
Great, well, thank you. So now we're gonna pass the baton to Allison Becker, who's in the Mayor's Office of Economic Development and the Promise Zone Director, and how the city began to be engaged and how the city is now viewing their role within the Promise Zone initiative.
Thanks, Eric. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us early in the morning to learn about this exciting and interesting project in Los Angeles. So Dixon pointed out about the numbers. You know, one of the key responsibilities of the City of Los Angeles in this framework for partnership is that, you know, we kind of are entrusted with managing the preference point certification process. And this is just one of several ways that we act as kind of the co-pilot for the initiative. We don't have a slide to illustrate this morning, but basically the City of Los Angeles, in partnership with YPI, are acting as the implementation actors in this effort. HUD serves as an advisor and supporter. Our entire leadership council acts as advisors and supporters. But really the city is a doer in this effort, which is very significant. It's tough. I think there were a number of conversations yesterday about how difficult it is for cities to literally be at the table with social sector or private sector initiatives, and then sustain that commitment over a long period of time, especially when you have you know, just the realities of the political process, changing administrations, changing priorities. I mean, just in the 3 years now that the designation has been in place, the mayor has been focused on citywide sustainability. He's currently hyper-focused on homelessness. And so, you know, this sort of initiative needs to be grounded at a place where it kind of survives those shifts in administrative priority. So for us, we're grounded in the Mayor's Office for Economic Development. And our job is primarily to function as the backbone organization. This is separate and apart from the backbone quarterback role that YPI plays within the Promise neighborhood context. The city is really focused on making sure that we deliver on the 4 goal areas. So the city is really committed to the federal system that we're going to make sure that we deliver on our commitments in these 4 goal areas. So we rely really heavily on YPI and the partnership that was constructed around promised neighborhoods to make sure that we're delivering on our education-related goals. They help push the actors at the county and at the school district to make sure that we're aligning and focusing there. The city, in turn, is really concerned with kind of the underlying aspects that we call community enablers, right? The emphasis on public safety, the emphasis on sustainable, livable communities, the emphasis on economic opportunity, workforce development, and the creation of jobs. And so for the city, we make the commitment to the federal system that we're going to deliver on all of these promises, and the backbone office within the mayor's administration is responsible for that. But we're a lean and mean organization. Basically, when you look at the Promise Zone initiative, Eric and myself, we're basically the two professional staff persons who are working full-time on this project. I also have, we have a team of young, enthusiastic, young professionals that come to us through the AmeriCorps Vista program that provide capacity building support for the partnership. They do a year of service with us and then they cycle out. So the way that this model needs to be operationalized has to take into account the fact that you're going to have an annual cycle of young people coming in to support this work. And so for the most part, the way that we've engaged them is by assigning them to work with working groups, to facilitate working groups within the partnership that are organized currently around these four policy buckets. In addition, they are charged with kind of the second half of, on the next set of, the next slide, with these two kind of objectives of creating systems and facilitating engagement. We talked a lot yesterday about the notion of transparency, accountability, and the challenges of building systems of accountability for complex projects like this. And I'll absolutely echo, those kinds of statements that government innovators simply don't have the human capital capacity, the kind of the technical capability to be developing these systems. It's certainly now that we're 2 full years into the initiative, one of the things that we're prioritizing this year. But it's really an area where our work could use support. I wanted to just talk about really briefly this idea of targeting and aligning, because that's, and then this idea about what success looks like. These were all, again, themes that came up consistently yesterday. So, again, right, to speak plainly, right, the Promise Zone initiative is a partnership initiative. Our vision is really focused on aligning actors towards a common agenda. We're in a big city like this. We have more than 50 organizations who are actively participating in this work. This notion of aligning and raising awareness and fostering an environment for participation is really what our principal aim is. And then the city, if you think that would be challenging, and the incredible work that the federal system has done to really align their myriad of agencies to support this work. The city is also charged with doing that. In practice, that means making sure that the police department is attentive to the concerns of groups like YPI that are implementing community policing projects in particular neighborhoods. It means that in communities like Pico Union or Westlake, where we have real problems with bulky item pickup, that the city is more attentive at lowering those response times. It really is, for example, focused in the work of the Economic and Workforce Development Department, both in their work source system, their youth source system, their business source system, that we're really targeting and aligning the city's resources to support this effort. Just one illustration here. We spent about a year working with EWDD to get a handle on how many young people were involved in our summer youth employment program, right? The assumption was from the system actors, right, the folks that are charged with rolling this program out citywide, that 2,000 youth were from this general vicinity, were definitely involved in the summer youth employment program. So when we fielded that commitment of reaching 2,000 youth within the promise zone, we felt very confident that we were going to be able to reach this number. But when we actually started digging into our messy administrative data, we found that we really couldn't answer the question about how many people participated, young people participated, and B, that we could only come up with about 800 kids who had applied from this area in 2014. So contrast that with the fact that we have about 11,000 high school students within Promise Zone schools, of which, let's just say, 6,000 of them are juniors and seniors. So of 6,000 eligible kids, only 800 wound up applying, and we really don't know of those 800 how many actually participated. So this sets up our alignment work very deliberately. We further uncovered the fact that from the private sector actors, right, not public sector jobs, we have a lot of departments and nonprofit social sector actors that employ youth, but from the private sector side, we only had 4 Promise Zone businesses of as many as 2,000 formal businesses, or probably more like 4,000 when you include the full breadth of the local economy. Only 4 were participating in the summer youth employment program. So this presents an amazing opportunity for the city to align its work more directly with the goals of the Promise Zone initiative.
You're going to hear me say partners and place-based throughout my presentation this morning. And if you take anything away from what we present, this effort in the Promise Zone initiative is place-based. It's not project-based, it's place-based. Los Angeles is not going to have the same strategies, the same accountability as a Des Moines, Iowa might have. So place-based solutions bubbling up from the community, and then leveraging all of the federal resources in a coordinated, collaborative effort is what's going to drive us to success. I unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, had been in the federal government for, as was said, 30-some years. The federal government hasn't always talked to each other, particularly at the federal agency side of the house. But Promise Zone efforts are engaging many federal agencies, and we're leveraging the resources at each of those agencies. They're at the table, and oddly enough, we're talking to each other. Now, from a national perspective, there's been a leadership of communities solutions task force that's been developed and established by the White House from a national perspective. And the goal of this task force is to implement two primary goals, and that's to deliver an existing place-based commitment and institutionalize the best practices of the work. Now, I want to drill down into what institutionalizing the best practice and the approach. There's been permanent staff, onboarding, and networking hiring at federal agencies, which means the Eric Yost of HUD is happening elsewhere in federal agencies, where they are tasked specifically with this interagency approach and working together. As I've said before, I know in the past, I've even said, oh, we don't do that, that's education department. Well, you're not going to hear that, particularly in the Promise Zone initiative. Again, we're going to have those key agency partners there in making an effort and actually delivering some outcomes. And I want to emphasize that the effort in the Promise Zone initiative is outcome-oriented. We aren't necessarily, while output is important, it's the outcome, the ultimate result that we're really going to be focused at, looking at from a federal standpoint. Now, I talked a little bit about the White House task force being established and actually hiring permanent staff. But I also want to talk that it isn't just hiring staff, you have to train your staff. So the end of next month, we'll be bringing all of our federal partners who I've talked about, positions like Eric, back to Washington and training them as to best practices. We've been 3 years in the effort, and now we ought to be sharing what we've learned, what has worked, and also what we could do a lot better. Now, we also, by institutionalizing, I mean that we've also established memorandums of understandings with our federal agencies. So we've said, here's what we're going to bring to the table. Here's what maybe you can bring to the table. So we're, again, institutionalizing the approach, which, again, hasn't always been done. Now, the designation of the Executive Steering Committee to oversee the Promise Zone initiative, HUD and USDA have been the primary responsibility for supporting the initiative, as I think Dixon or Eric mentioned before. But it has three primary purposes, this steering committee. One is to provide a forum for accountability for federal agencies. Two, to elevate issues requiring a higher level of attention, coordination, and sensitivity. And again, the third is institutionalizing place-based and interagency efforts by building strong relationships among leadership and federal agency staff. And again, we want this effort to be institutionalized for more than 10 years, actually. The initiative only lasts for 10 years, but the approach is going to last hopefully in emphasis, in forever, so to speak, because we don't want to go back to this silo stacked federal agency singular approach to solving community challenges and needs. Now, in the service of these goals, the steering committee has developed a process of accountability in which community needs are identified and agency commitments in the Promise Zone communities are tracked. HUD and USDA has conducted needs assessments in 13 existing promise zones. Now, when the additional promise zones are announced in the spring of this year, we will also do a community needs assessment in these particular designated zones. The purpose of the assessments was to identify priorities for FY16 for each promise zone and to highlight specific areas of need for assistance to be provided by federal agencies in supporting these goals. The communities validated their priorities and agencies have reaffirmed their commitments, and a process is underway to deliver resources to support community accomplishments of priority strategies. So HUD is extremely serious about the accountability component of the promise zone. It isn't just an effort of speaking, it's an effort of achieving outcomes. And we, on the federal side, are going to be working with our partners at all levels in making sure there is success so that we can build upon what already is working in the various communities. Now, I won't go back and reiterate what's been said on some of the federal agencies involved, 51 grants that are currently in. But the next, as I said, the next designations of promise zones are going to be coming very, very soon. I wish I could tell you which communities and when the announcement will come, but stay tuned. It's coming. It's exciting. I don't even know. And I sometimes think it's good I don't know because I'd be sharing it with everybody. So it is being looked at, it's being vetted, and heck, it may even come out next week, who knows.
Is that a spoiler?
Yeah, exactly, that's to tempt everybody. I do want to share a couple of outcomes that we're reporting on a national level, and I'm always one to toot our own horn here in Los Angeles. But guess who else is going to toot your horn if you don't do that? In Los Angeles, the Promise Zone college preparedness is exceeding the city school district average, and new entrepreneurship training is expanding economic opportunities for low-income workers, including immigrants and refugees. So we're actually tooting our horn in this area. Now, in San Antonio, high school graduation rates have increased alongside school attendance. A new equity investment fund is growing local small businesses, and at-risk and re-entering youth are gaining access to new job skills in growing sectors like healthcare. Those are two examples of successful outcomes that we think are making a big difference in those in the communities I've mentioned. And of course, the federal government's going to provide the technical assistance side. I sort of assume that that's going to always take place, but for those sitting out there saying, well, I thought that's all the federal government did was the technical assistance side. No, by no means. We are at the table. We are the conveners. We are the facilitators with our good partners of the city and YPI and others. That is certainly the federal role. Now, the PlaceBased Executive Committee is another committee that has been established. And again, that goal is to better align staffing processes and tools to enhance collaboration of HUD staff doing place-based work in headquarters and field. I mentioned about silo busting. My agency at HUD hasn't always done that, and you're seeing that migrating. We can't do business as we have done in the past. We must leverage our resources in all program areas. If it's housing, you ought to have community planning and development at the table. If it's homelessness, it's all of HUD's programs working together with all of our federal partners and making a difference. In the Promise Zone, if it's addressing homeless youth in the designated zone, we ought to have all the players at the table. We ought to be leveraging our housing choice voucher program, our multi-family portfolio, and all the other federal programs in certainly all of the education programs there, which again, we aren't just, HUD isn't just applying its programs, it's leveraging our programs with education, with labor, with transportation. That's making a big difference, and quite frankly, is a big change from the past. Allison talked a little bit about capacity building. I know that she and I and others, and Dixon would say that, yeah, we need more staff. We need more partners. We can't have enough partners and staff. But our basic core federal vision is to have a community liaison like Eric, have VISTA volunteers, have that federal agency commitment, have a strategic plan that is trackable, and to assist with data evaluation. You can't tell Congress and others that a program has been successful without data. So that's a key and integral part from not only, I think, from the federal side, but our partners' side as well. Mm-hmm. So I encourage you to go online and just Google LA Promise Zone, and you'll see all the wonderful activities going on in that effort. Now, I know I've taken my time, Eric, so I know that I'm going to jump over and close by saying that the administration's made it clear that the federal government's commitment is to make sure that our agencies work together more effectively to provide needed talent and resources to support the promise zones. We talked a lot, or we've inferred about the urban promise zones. We have rural promise zones as well. And the whole, be it urban or rural, you're still going to get the same approach. Through the work, we're building a new standard for partnering and investing in low-income communities to expand opportunities for all Americans. While the work to transform America's hardest-hit communities will take years, the work that's already underway has been promising. That's not a play on words. It truly is a promise in the promise zone. HUD, like many other federal agencies, will continue on a course of deepening engagement in the promise zones. But it may take more than just it will take more than just the federal government to accomplish success. We can't do it alone, which is why I thank both Dixon and Allison. We're in this together. And if you see your organization playing a role, we welcome you to the table. I can't stress that enough. The verse of "it takes a village," this is really going to take a village. The communities that have been designated are in great need, but together we can, and we're going to make a difference. We're going to have an impact, and we're going to make lives better for all. So again, we're glad to be part of this dynamic partnership. Again, I'll end by the way I began in thanking our partners, and I encourage you to maybe look at what you bring to the table, and together we can make a difference.
Thanks, Ray.
So we wanted to, do we have a few minutes for questions? Q&A, great. So questions from the audience or Twitter land?
Hi, Sam Loy from Mexico City. I am the one who is taking the responsibility in Mexico City to develop the special economic zones, which is very related and very, it's very related to this program. One of the most important challenges that we are facing with is, yesterday I say that, is the issue of gentrification. Yesterday I was realized that gentrification here is more a racial thing, if I am allowed to say that. And in Mexico City is more related with socio-economic matters. So my question is, how, if this is the case, how you deal with these kind of scenarios, social behaviors, social discrepancies and these kind of things, with the need to leverage private capital and bring those needs to those areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one of those, interestingly enough, from HUD's perspective, in the 6 years I've been there, I don't hear that word gentrification. It's the word we don't hear very often. We hear displacement more. But interestingly enough, last week we had a webinar on displacement and talking about gentrification in communities and where that's happening. And just this last week alone, quite interestingly enough, the White House has taken a big interest in this, and we are starting the data team, so the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy and the Domestic Policy Council is starting to look at that and using PROMA zones as the prime testing ground for that, because what I always say about, for example, our LA PROMA zone, it's deceptively quiet. Because you go there, you see an immense amount of economic opportunity, but yet we shared the statistics on really what's happening in the community about very dense populated communities, lots of poverty, and so what does that mean? So how do you engage and activate markets to ensure that's happening, whether you're trying to look at through some of our strategies on community benefits agreements to ensure that we're having the nonprofit organizations and those engaged, working with the city sector on ensuring that people understand the rent stabilization ordinance and understanding what they can do, and then working with our affordable housing partners to ensure that we are building the affordable housing in the community and that those in the affordable housing community have a voice for the new developments. So that's my perspective, but it would be great to hear from those that are working in it on that question.
So first, we're available to come to Mexico City if you'd like us to visit. I want to make that clear. Secondly, I would just say our Promise Zone is unique nationally in that this is not your traditional sort of inner city community that has no economic activity. We have Hollywood in our Promise Zone. And that was really fundamental part of our strategy, which is there's a lot of economic opportunity, a lot of jobs, a lot of buildings going up, a lot of cranes. But the folks in the community are not getting the benefits of those jobs and business opportunities. And so we need to create a pipeline, both on the human side and the business side, where people can tap into this so that they don't get displaced, so they can afford to stay there, so they can afford housing. And so we built it along the metro line, so the folks in Pico Union, where you've got some of the highest poverty, can go 3 stops up to Hollywood, where the jobs are. Now there's a lot of work that goes into that, right? Because there's a lot of training and skills development you got to do. It's not just enough to get on the metro line, right? You got to be able to do the job. But it's really, for us, it's a really important factor and helps shape why our Promise Zone looks like what it does.
Again, I think one of the really unique things about this effort is that we're deliberately putting place-based professionals or built environment professionals together with social sector or human capital professionals to have conversations about how to make this model work. In a prior life, I worked for the Community Redevelopment Agency. So you see the red line, right? Literally the red line, which is our one subway system through the central part of Los Angeles. Basically, the city, through its former redevelopment agency, had several project areas, Westlake, Wilshire Center, East Hollywood, and Hollywood, where for 20 years, we were anticipating, there was a lot of discussion yesterday in the value capture panel about anticipating development, anticipating this kind of churn that was going to happen as the rail presented and became active. And so the redevelopment agency with Metro was very deliberate about employing a transit-oriented strategy that was inclusive along Western Avenue, which is kind of right in the middle there, the redevelopment agency over the course of the aughts, constructed more than 1,000 units of permanent affordable housing to support the existing resident population in that part of Hollywood. So as Dixon said, as kind of Hollywood is transforming, as it's revitalizing, the city anticipated that, in some ways, we were employing smart strategies. We did the best we could while the market was still soft to really engage and build housing. So what we're coming in now with the Promise Zone designation is kind of this phase of refinement, right? We're focusing on that. Professionals don't always like to talk about it like this, but the naturally occurring affordable housing, the housing that's currently protected by the rent stabilization ordinance, and we're really focusing on making sure that where we can protect covenanted housing, that we do that we're making sure that residents are aware of their rights when they're in housing, but we anticipate that we're going to continue to see market rate housing constructed in these communities, and that's also desirable from a public policy perspective.
This has been really compelling. Fred Silva with California Forward, we spent a lot of time on realigning state interests and community interests, local government interests primarily, that you all are trying to do this institutionally in a space which is exciting. And I have a question for Allison and Dixon regarding those 6,000 kids and the fact that you're focusing really at this ground level on individuals. We had a compelling discussion about human capital yesterday.
Yeah.
And with those 6,000 kids, that's a perfect set of data to measure results. What's happened to those 6,000 kids? Now, it happens that the state's putting a bunch of money into CTE. So some of them want to be auto mechanics for BMW. They will make a ton of money doing that. If others want to get either to the CSU system or the UC system, they will not pay a nickel of tuition because tuition's free given their income. So what's happened to the 6,000 kids?
So I'll start. We have, so CTE, so career technical education, and linked learning are critical parts of our education strategy for the Promise Zone, for the Promise neighborhood. We have some of the school district's most promising linked learning schools are in the Promise neighborhood and Promise Zone. So it's really important to us. We just got one of the CTE incentive grants from the state. The district just got a big CTE incentive grant from the state. So the state's putting in resources around that piece. I'm going to switch from the 6,000 number to a 5,000 number. Through this federal designation, we were able to get a large chunk of federal money to take 5,000 6th and 7th graders, 5,000, and follow them for the next 7 years through their first year of college. This is going to be kind of a transformative model, we hope, to show how do you take a cohort of kids, and as a comparison, that's as many 6th and 7th graders in the entire city of Boston. That's the size of the cohort we're taking. And sticking with those same kids for 7 years, providing them every conceivable support along the way, engaging them in career pathways when they get to the high school level, and then finding out what happens to those kids once they get through the first year of college. And because we have the agreement with the district that we can have student level data on all these kids, we can really track each kid over time, each kid and their family over time, to see what works, what doesn't, what needs to be adjusted. I'll let Allison take the summer jobs.
Well, I mean, so just kind of pivoting a little bit from there. So while our social sector and kind of LAUSD partners are focused at the kind of student level and tracking students, kind of the city is concerned with school performance within these 45 schools that are located within the zone. So we're also kind of monitoring how are things going at that school site? Are there things at that school site that can be done, or things that are happening in that immediate community that are impacting performance at that school? Again, a school-centered model for kind of providing and targeting resources or services to support quality of life. So Dixon mentioned linked learning. In the case of the Promozone, actually 6 of the 10 certified linked learning programs in the city of Los Angeles happen to be located in Promozone schools, which is, you know, an amazing resource for us. And so our next set of work is really going to be doing a better job. As I mentioned, those 4, I didn't even tell you what kind of businesses were engaged. Basically, a Rite Aid, the Chinese theater, I think a Denny's. You know, so we really have quite a lot of work to do with the private sector business actors to engage them more specifically in this linked learning approach. We just had a local economic analysis prepared by a consultant which basically found, not surprisingly, that 95% of the business activity within the Promozone is categorized as small business, meaning that they have 25 employees or less. Again, they came up with about 2,400 businesses that kind of rise to the level of the formal economy. That doesn't take into account by any stretch of the imagination, you know, the other probable half of economic activity that's taking place in the informal economy. But our job with these linked learning pathways is to help kids from the neighborhood actually access opportunities in the dominant industries if they choose within the Promozone. In this case, the information sector broadly defined, which includes motion picture, all the post-production, those sorts of businesses, as well as the healthcare sector. We have a major regional center for healthcare located in the Promozone, and our local community college, I'll finish here, the LA City College already has a very well-designed, probably more than 10 years from now, healthcare career ladder program that is taking kids from LACC and sending them right up the block to the hospital regional center, where we have Kaiser, Hollywood Presbyterian, Children's Hospital, and others, making that, you know, kind of connection express.
Yeah, the only other point I just wanted to bring up on that, as well as with the 46 schools that we have in the Promozone, really the goal is to turn them into full-service community schools. So YPI was very successful in targeting some of the federal grants that go towards that model, so the full-service community school model, to do that, and the 13 schools that have been converted, and using, as you look on the map too, from the whole thing we were talking about yesterday about community, the enablers in the community, is looking at the schools as the central focus for a lot of the social service resources. And so really thinking innovatively about doing joint use agreements for having community school parks rather than building school parks, because it's a very dense neighborhood. So a lot of innovative strategies about using the school as the hub for the community in this district that YPI is focused on. Any other questions we can jump to? Great.
Good morning, Michael Banner, and I run the Los Angeles LDC, which is a finance company. And I've worked in Hollywood and Westlake. Currently, my office is just a little east of Pico Union. I have actually 2 questions. One is, on one of the slides you talk about one of the goals of the Promozone is to, I guess, promote innovative economic development strategies. So I wonder if you can cite a couple of those examples. And then the second question relates to the fact that the zone, I guess you could say, is connected to a cluster in as much as you have Hollywood and entertainment there. In a similar sense, Culver City has the same thing. And Culver City only had a redevelopment agency zone at one point in time, just like you have in the Promozone. But you look at the outcomes, if you measure in outcomes, completely different than what you would characterize the outcomes in Culver City than in Hollywood. You know, you both have transit there. And I'm wondering, in looking at the differentials, are you looking at what's happening in a kind of non-government directed activity that seems to be flourishing, where you get that example of venture capital-backed startups are in the Culver City, Playa Vista area. And my guess is that what you're promoting in the Promise Zone is small microloan, micro-entrepreneurship, which is fine. But in terms of the notion of big change that we started out yesterday, how do we get to big changes in a Promise Zone when we're focused on very small incremental pieces?
I mean, I'll just start by, I think there was a gentleman, the gentleman yesterday from City Heights was talking about how important it is for immigrants to have landing pads, right? And this community fundamentally for years and years and years has been the landing pad for immigrant communities. And that's why it has so much hustle, that's why it has so much vitality, and that's why it really does serve that role of being the place where parents come so that their children succeed. And I think that's one of the reasons why our strategy is so strongly focused on on community schools and the education system. But at the same time, we have to recognize that with all that hustle, with all of that informal economy, the city has to get better at supporting entrepreneurship, this level of entrepreneurship. We've had, many struggles in this space over, since I've been practicing in community development. We're taking yet another stab. A new generation of planners are trying to figure out how to support street vendors, for example, other folks who participate in the informal economy. At the same time, we do want to look at examples, for example, out of Cleveland, the Cleveland Clinic's kind of ecosystem that they've created both for job hiring, procurement, and worker cooperative strategies that have helped to really embed that hospital complex in Cleveland and support their local neighborhood. Those are the kinds of opportunities that we have with our sticky institutions in East Hollywood, just starting out with our relationships through YPI and other social sector actors with Kaiser, for example, to kind of open the door to a deeper level of engagement like that in Cleveland is something that we're really hoping to explore over the next couple of years.
So we have to end here, and the two things that I want to leave you with is, again, envisioning Pluto in 10 years. And then the second, again, is this activating markets and what we're trying to do here in the Promise Zone and really using it as an innovation ground. So thank you very much, and thank you to our panelists.
The panel as well. Thank you very much.